Sawadee-ka. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to all of you joining us from different parts of the globe today. My name is Monica, and on behalf of VNU Asia Pacific, we would like to warmly welcome you to Redcon Asia's third webinar series entitled Nature-Based Solutions for Urban Resilience, linking science, tech, policy, and practice. Redcon Asia, or Resilience on Emergency and Disaster Conference Asia, is a multi-stakeholder conference and exhibition that envisions to engage business sector leaders, government authorities, international agencies, academia, media, and financing institutions, among others, in the value chain of disaster and emergency management. Our mission is to scale up collaborative efforts to drive inclusive resilience and to contribute in the global efforts towards the achievement of the UN Sustainable Development Goals 2030. Redcon Asia is set to take place at the United Nations Conference Center in Bangkok in December next year, and we are delighted to share with you that we have the support of the Department of Disaster Prevention and Mitigation under the Ministry of Interior Thailand, Asian Disaster Preparedness Center or ADPC, KMUTT or King Mongkut's University of Technology Thonburi, Mekong Institute, GVF, and the University of Newcastle in Australia to advance the vision that we have for Redcon Asia. And now, please allow me to introduce to you our beloved moderator. So she is currently serving at the National Board of the Department of Disaster Prevention and Mitigation under Ministry of Interior Thailand. And she also used to serve as Disaster Management Advisor to the Pacific Disaster Center in Hawaii and various United Nations agencies. So other areas of expertise served are Policy and Strategic Analyst for Bangkok Metropolitan Authority, Open Government and Participation Subcommittee for the Office of the Public Sector Development Commission, and Policy Innovation Assessor to NIA or National Innovation Agency Thailand. And she is none other than Dr. Tavida Kamonvej, the Dean of the School of Political Science from Thammasat University. So Dr. Tavida, take it away, please.
Thank you. Swadika. Thank you very much, Monica. It's really a tremendous introduction of mine. And I don't know, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning and good evening. And perhaps some of you about to go to bed things. So today, the webinar that we have today is to share what I call in my own nickname. We have kind of both multidisciplinary and hybridization of speakers today to share of our goal of now today, according to Sustainable Development Goals, we are trying to derive into what we call resilient society, resilient community, or even resilient nation, and perhaps resilient world. In order to actually address resiliency and the climate change adaptation or climate change mitigation, as we all agree that today is the problem, I would like to use the webinar as the open space, the platform that not only the speakers that we have really famous guru and master, which I'm going to introduce roughly first, not only in the platform for the speaker to basically share their knowledge, theory, approach, and experience, but I also would actually make this platform to share between the audience, any of you in the room that want to share your experience or want to reflect the picture of your community, your country, the obstacle, the difficulties, or the best practice or worst practice, anything that you would like to share, use the platform, this webinar to share. We have an open space in Q&A. We have in the chat box that you can leave your message or any question or inquiry direct to the audience, direct to the speakers, so that we can learn of what elements and information each of everyone has. I myself, as a moderator, believe that usually, in the platform that we bring in a lot of experts and people whom we think that we know best coming together in the platform. Sometimes we don't know the answer because too many of us are kind of like, we have our own bias since we are all expert as on the screen that you see right now. We are so in love with disaster. We are so in love with climate change. So sometimes we are drowning. We are overloading by all the knowledge and information, and we couldn't find a solution or even a good recommendation. So most of the time, question and answer and some comments from the audience according to the same topic actually raised a very good question and new question for us so that we can expand and exchange knowledge later on. As on the screen, I have a lot of speakers today with me, so I'm not going to waste the time too much. Let me quickly introduce all of them by name and face first, and then I will actually go deep into each of them when time comes. I have 4 speakers with me today. I'm having Mark, which I have a nickname for every single one of them. I'm going to give you the nickname first so that, and then you get to know them before they talk and when they talk. I actually named Mark as a master of water. I'm going to call him that. I think he is somehow a person who actually really know about water management, water related thing. I will introduce him in detail in a bit when his time starts. Next on the screen is Cherry. I actually give her the nickname too. I think she is a lady of insurance as economic investment. We will see that not only the tools, technical tools, not only scientific, not only engineering, you will also have economic tools, market tools to do the development that actually comply with sustainable development goal. Next is Richard. I call Richard is the guru of coastal engineering and climate change adaptation. You will see at his experience and knowledge, he's really a guru of bringing in those engineering together with the adaptation and management. Last but not the least on the screen next to the other side is Tite. I call him a wizard of Asia. Why I'm calling him that instead of bringing him as a wizard of water resource management? Because he has a lot of projects in Asia. And I think today he will exchange a lot on that with us. So these are all the speakers that I have today, 4 of them. Let's introduce you guys to the first speakers of today. The first speaker of today would be Mark Arnold. Can I have the banner of Mark coming up? Okay, thank you very much. Please welcome the first speaker. My first speaker is from Prepared International. And the reason that I give his nickname as a master of water and water related kind of management, because he actually have his studies and his knowledge and his experience from the Netherlands, which is the country that we believe that is really a top country in doing water management. He also have his expertise toward bringing in governance, public engagement, information, and behavior into the water management and those disaster management, which is really important because you cannot actually finding a solution only for the technical side. You also need institutional arrangement, governance, behavior, population, and community side. He's also an expert and have his experience on those international response, coordination, socio-economic impact analysis, as well as he is one of the person who contribute to an end-to-end tsunami warning in the British Virgin Islands. So I think this is close to December 26th, the Indian Ocean Andaman tsunami last time. So I think we're really grateful to have you today, Mark. And I'm not gonna waste time any longer. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on our beautiful planet. My name is Mark Arnold, Master of Water. That's intriguing. I feel a little bit like a Master of Water since I'm living below sea level, actually, in the Netherlands, like a lot of people do. But I want to present to you a little bit from a different angle. Mainly also as an advisor working for various governments in the Caribbean and in the Netherlands and in other places. So I have kind of an advice to policy advisors kind of perspective in mind when we talk about nature-based solutions. So again, my name is Mark Arnold. I'm the head of analysis at Prepared International, which I want to introduce super quickly. Prepared International on the next slide. Prepared International is an organization registered in Germany, specialized in preparedness to disaster. We work all over the world, including also in Asia, and we implemented climate change adaptation projects in India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, Myanmar, Laos, and probably I'm forgetting a couple of countries. We focus on emergency preparedness and response, analysis and assessments, disaster risk reduction, capacity building, and resilience building. We developed a methodology for movement and migration, people movement and evacuation and migration. And we focus on climate change adaptation, including food security. And we work for private sector and public sector alike. Enough about me and my organization. Let's dive into the topic of today, the nature-based solutions. On the next slide, please. And why we are here today is because nature-based solutions for disaster impact and climate change adaptations are super important. As we all know, in the last 2 decades, the impact of natural disasters have been growing and more devastating. In total, an estimated 4 billion people have been affected by disasters, including killing more than 1 million persons and causing around $2.9 trillion in economic losses. So watershed degradation has impacted drinking water for over 700 million people, costing global cities alone $5.4 billion in treatment, and drought affect an average of 35 million people each year. And because of climate change, these numbers are growing. I just want to mention that in high-risk zones, like in parts of Asia, some people are hit multiple times during their lifespan. So there's really a need to change the way we do things and to limit the exposure to risks. Just one number that I want to mention, and not to get too technical, but the World Research Institute estimated that every year we emit 50 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere. And this is globally, it's recognized as the greenhouse gas. And it has risen 50% between the period of 1990 to 2018. And since the atmosphere is only made up of 0.03% of carbon, these emissions really add to the global climate change. The ecosystems are adjusted to a very low percentage of carbon in the air, and we are changing that the rate of growth of this carbon rapidly. So nature-based solutions are addressing that, because nature-based solutions are often green, and green has the ability to absorb carbon. Let me take you to the next slide, a simulation from NASA, where we can see this effect of nature, plants and trees on carbon emissions. We see on the left-hand side all the red colors are high levels of CO2, and this is in the beginning of spring, when trees are starting to grow, and then a couple of months later, when we see that photosynthesis is up and running and trees are green, that is carbon dioxide has been absorbed by nature. So really adding green to our environment really significantly impacts the amount of CO2 and greenhouse gases in the air. This picture, in our experience, tells a convincing story about the value of green solutions for climate impact. If we then go to the next slide, we can see that our thinking is not always green. Traditionally, gray or hard infrastructure is the main choice for solving and protecting against disaster challenges. Traditionally, we think about steel and concrete to protect ourselves. This should obviously change into solutions that are green. On the next slide, I have this example. Except absorbing some of the carbon emissions in the atmosphere, natural systems have long provided many of the services communities seek from grey infrastructure, protection from natural hazards, and provision of key resources such as water and energy. Natural systems also provide additional benefits. For example, mangroves provide coastal protection, but as nurseries of fish and everything that lives in the ocean, they also support fishery and thus food security. Timber and non-timber forest products also come from nature-based solutions. And ecotourism, including diving, are also economic factors that come into play when introducing nature-based solutions. This was actually the next slide that I was talking about, showing a picture of mangrove forests, one of the great examples of coastal protection and also supporting economic growth in fisheries. So the next slide is what are nature-based solutions? What are nature-based solutions? Nature-based solutions is an approach that uses natural systems to provide critical service, such as wetlands for flood mitigation or mangroves to reduce the impact of waves, storm surge, and coastal erosion. In urban environments, nature-based solution can support water management and support cooling of the average temperature in cities. And these solutions can also synergize with grey infrastructure, forming so-called hybrid solutions. And these, yes, the next slide, please. And nature-based solutions are really implemented all over the world to tackle various challenges with climate change. So if there is so much to say about why nature-based solutions are so important and why they have so much added value, why is it so complicated in some countries, in some areas, to convince political leadership to actually choose for nature-based solutions instead of the grey solutions? And what some of the challenges, on the next slide, please. I would like to mention that we encounter, and that is that establishing an evidence base for nature-based solutions, for instance, by quantifying ecosystem services and or assessing their added value and co-benefits, can be very hard to convince political leadership of that. Also, the response of ecosystems and the costs of to maintain these ecosystems are much harder to predict than a concrete or a structure or a steel structure. So this means that there's insecurity sometimes, perceived insecurities. Also advocating for nature-based solutions by communicating their multifunctionality and ability to contribute to various political areas such as climate change and public health, nature protection and economic development. It makes it a little bit hard because the benefits are distributed over multiple areas, multiple policy fields. So there's not always one clear owner of the advantages of nature-based solution. Next slide, please. And this makes it hard sometimes to collaborate within governments to really support and mainstream the reason for implementing nature-based solutions. Just moving ahead a little bit faster. Next slide, please. What are some of the solutions that we find when we are advising governments to think of green nature-based solutions on the longer run? And there is like a lot of literature now. The volume of literature available to support nature-based solutions is growing super rapidly. So where there might have been, until recent history, a lot of concerns or questions about nature-based solution, the number of studies showing and calculating the advantages of nature-based solutions has seen a revolution over the last couple of years. And also the guidance on how to argument and to calculate the advantages of nature-based solutions has exploded. So some of this cynicism that is there, that has been built over years, can be taken away when advising political leadership following those guidelines. I presented here 3 guidelines that we found super useful in our work. It's always tailored to a certain economic system in a certain area on the planet, but this information is now there, and we have much more insights in determinants of the value of urban nature, for instance, but also the value of mental wellness. I quoted here one report from the Asian Development Bank. On my next slide, and this is where I want to conclude, is it's not only a discussion, nature-based solution between completely green or completely gray on the other side. We find that where the political discourse is mainly focused on hard infrastructure, concrete and steel, it's very hard to convince political leadership to go completely green. You might add green to a hard engineered infrastructure to become a little bit nature-based. And so it's a gliding scale from let nature fully take its course and take over versus fully engineering hard infrastructure. There's a middle ground that can be used to start introducing green and nature-based solutions and to support with that well-being of people, but also economic value and biodiversity. With that, I want to close my part of the presentation. On my sheets that you can find online, I have two cities that I would like to present to you as good examples of nature-based solutions. That's Shenzhen in China. It's called the Sponge City, a mega large city that applied nature-based solutions. And then also a very small town in England called Pickering, a very small community where with inexpensive nature-based solutions, they lowered the risk of flooding significantly. So be inspired by those examples. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and back to the moderator. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mark. I really want to have like 3 hours with you. And because your topic is so kind of like, it's really modern and classic. It's hybrid in itself. When you talk about the hybridization of the gray structure and green structure, that's to a lot of government, to a lot of the nation, is actually really a dilemma because a gray structure usually perceived like massive protection, prevention, and quick to start, quick to get the result. While the green kind of structure, people kind of think like it's slow and is it gonna work? So political side, put it that way, as Mark said. On the other way around, people who live in the green structure that have their livelihood fulfilled with that green structure, would they be able to compensate in terms of this combination of the gray and the green? I would really like to have you talk more, but then let's come back when it's time of discussion so that we can actually dig up a little more. Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Let me move on to the next speaker of today. Next speaker of today, as I already introduced him, that I named him as a guru of coastal engineering and climate, kind of like impact and mitigation. Richard is a Tolkien and Taylor's technical director. His work as a coastal engineering incorporating climate change, resilience, and adaptation. He works a lot regarding this engineering, coastal process, hazard assessment. And he also shares his interest in terms of climate change impact and adaptation. So I'm really think that people who are at the coastal line at this point in time have a lot of effect from the climate change. I'm from Thailand, and a lot of my coastal areas actually been affected by that already. So having you, Richard, today to talk about those kind of nature-based solution is also a marvelous time today. So let's move to you. The floor is yours, Richard.
Hey, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction and a really good presentation from Mark, I think covering all of the major topics that we really need to think about. Now, if we can just start my presentation, I'll go through at quite a clip. Really, my topic is around theory and practice, and I'll tell you a little bit about myself and actually, I won't need to tell you about myself because it's already been said by a wonderful moderator, but if we go to the next slide, Tonkin and Taylor, I guess probably what I should say is Tēnā koutou katoa, called Richard Ryan and Hamel Toka Ingoa. I'm coming from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and proud to be the very south part of the Pacific and an island nation surrounded by the sea and all those forces. Tonkin and Taylor's a New Zealand company, was founded in 1959, and we're employee owned. We're about 1,000 people with offices in Australia, Malaysia, and New Zealand. One of the things that we take pride in is we're the interface between people and the environment, earth, water, and air, and we're using science and engineering of creating really good outcomes for our communities. If we can go to the next slide. The areas where we work, as you saw on the previous map, is largely across Australasia, Asia, and the Pacific. And we've spent a lot of time doing work in the Pacific and are really conscious of the issues and the challenges of island nations, SIDS, and the like, and the challenges with climate change. So we've worked from environmental impact assessments through to disaster risk and resilient projects across the Pacific, extending into Southeast Asia. And I guess we've also tried to work quite hard on that Pacific collaboration and working with Indigenous communities and looking at affordable protection methods. And there's an example up there of some coastal protection studies we did as guidelines for Pacific communities. It's an interesting issue, cost, and talking about concrete and steel. A lot of these places don't have concrete or steel or rocks. It all has to be imported. So there's a big cost for doing conventional protection. And that's where I think there's some real opportunities for natural and nature-based solutions. So if we move to the next slide, please. So what are natural and nature-based features? The term natural nature-based features refers to the use of landscape features to provide flood risk and erosion management benefits. And these projects produce other economic, environmental and social benefits, as Mark has pointed out. And they may be natural, hence the term natural, produced purely by natural processes, or nature-based that are informed or produced by a combination of natural processes and human engineering. And they can include a whole range of features such as beaches, dunes, wetlands, reefs, and islands. And as Mark pointed out, they can be used alone or in combination with each other. So what this diagram here shows is NBF kind of approaches look at protection of natural systems, the management and the restoration of natural systems with positive outcomes. And the examples here were mangroves, coral reefs, and wetlands that are all part of systems through the Pacific and Asia. And they provide risk reduction and resilience benefits as well as co-benefits. So the example that we show here is for a wetland construction, for example. It can change and attenuate wave energy. It can avoid flooding. It can also avoid erosion of erodible soft materials within harbour environments. And that can provide a societal benefit in avoiding damage costs. Now, the co-benefits for these kind of wetland constructions is changing in fishery productions if they're nursery areas. But one of the things I'm interested in also is there a carbon offset through an ETS or through carbon sequestration of providing these kind of systems? And I think that's a research area that's certainly worth looking into in both mangroves and wetlands, as their sequestration abilities are becoming better understood. And there's quite a lot of recent publications on those. So that's another co-benefit that I'll be talking about a little bit later on. If I could have the next slide, please. And as Mark pointed out, there's a lot of new resources that are available to assist people looking at natural and nature-based features. What I have here is a new international guideline, an NBF, on natural-based features for flood risk management. This was a project initiated and led by the US Army Corps of Engineers as part of its Engineering with Nature initiative. And Dr. Todd Bridges and his team worked with the Rijkswaterstaat in the Netherlands, the Environment Agency in the United Kingdom, as well as many organizations that provided leadership and participation. They had over 180 practitioners, researchers, engineers, and scientists, and other professionals from 77 public, private, non-government, non-profit, and academic organizations. So it was a really big effort, and it got published, I think, in August this year. Really good resource available. So its purpose is to inform the use of natural systems and functions to support flood risk management, and they refer to actions taken to reduce future damage to people and property caused by flooding and erosion in coastal and fluvial systems. And for each of the sections, there are key messages and guidances for professionals to use. So what you can see on the left-hand side of the slide is the layout of the chapters for the NNBF. And as you can see, there's a chapter for all the systems that you want to look at, and all of the management approaches and guidelines. So looking at community engagement, looking at fluvial systems, providing information to governments and governors on the benefits, the theory of adaptive management, but as well as the practical things of what we do and how you do NNBF in beaches and dunes, coastal features, reefs and islands. Dr. Bridges has a really nice analogy for this, though. It's a guide for chefs. It's not a cookbook or a black box. There's still a lot of challenges in NNBF and taking a systems view. So the idea of this kind of guideline, which is really starting the process and will continue to be an ongoing and growing resource on the website. There's a lot of new resource coming almost on a weekly basis to assist people understanding how to use appropriately NNBF kind of solutions. And if we could move to the next slide, it's also, though, important to note that it's a tool to use in understanding the whole system. So NNBF requires collaboration across a whole range of expertise groups. It isn't just a job for engineers. It requires ecologists, social scientists, and planners that understand the whole system that needs to be understood. There's also here in New Zealand, a role for Indigenous populations who have deeper knowledge of Indigenous plants and species that can assist with certain functions in nature-based solutions. So that support, knowledge, and engagement from Indigenous people is a really interesting and an important thing to understand, to get more information out of how things work and what the responses can be. So understanding of local systems and performance, consideration of the whole of life and wider ecosystem benefits. The whole of life cost is increasingly becoming a big factor when you add in the carbon cost for modern day concrete and steel construction, particularly if you're transporting it or systems through small island systems through the Pacific or Southeast Asia. There is a large cost. And increasingly with providing a carbon cost as well as a dollar cost, that's going to give you greater insights into, I guess, the harm for the concrete and steel kind of systems. Nature-based solutions, Mark showed that really nice slide that shows it goes from, you can go from green to grey. It also goes, I think, broader than that. Maybe some areas in the future are still areas that we have to avoid or plan retreat from. So I'd just like to extend that out into, this is a tool for a range of adaptive solutions that we need to consider for our management of our coastlines and our communities. I'm just going to step you through a few smaller case studies. And these are, if I can have the next slide, please. So these are purposely chosen, I guess, small local scale kind of initiatives. This is a subdivision here in New Zealand in a harbour environment, and we were involved in looking at a management strategy to manage the erosion of some 5 or 6 kilometres of coastline. And the traditional approach, this was done in the 1990s, would have been to put some rock walls or some concrete walls on the structure. We had a harbour environment with some very soft eroding banks that even with the low wave climate that operated with the harbour environment was causing quite large scale erosion. And there was council infrastructure, their wastewater pipes and electricity in the reserve between the eroding bank and the houses, so needing to do something rather than just let erosion take its course. In studying the system, we noticed mangroves, salt marsh were present in certain areas of the harbour, but not in these more exposed settings. So understanding the operating environment and examining where the salt marshes were thriving, we came up with design criteria of the ideal operational regime of these salt marshes. And what it needed in this area was a low rock sill, seaward of where the eroding bank was, to provide some wave trapping or wave breaking to allow the salt marsh to thrive through an operational regime that it was used to. So if we move into the next slide. So what we had is that rock sill was a lower cost, used less rock resource, but provided enough energy reduction that the planting landward of the rock sill could thrive and provide green benefits and prevent ongoing shoreline erosion. Some of the issues with the project, which I think is of interest, is a lot of our rules and regulations over the last 20, 30 years is as a result of hard structures, and our planning regulations were trying to avoid the use of hard structures but weren't supportive of nature-based solutions. So I think it's interesting to understand the policy changes and requirements for nature-based solutions because they need space. And that space sometimes crosses boundaries or into different planning zones, and that needs to be considered. If I could just shoot through to the last slide. I've just been given the hurry up. I'm sorry, speaking too slow. The key message I'd like you to take away is we've got to where we are through poor land management and unsustainable use of natural resources and degraded ecosystems. And nature systems can be cost-effective and no-regret solutions. Often vegetation and nurseries can be grown by local and indigenous people at lower cost, and they're a local resource rather than an imported resource. And so we can mitigate effects of natural hazards, but we still need to have better guidance on the operational conditions to support the designs. What does the system do? What is its benefits? How much reduction in wave energy, for example, does a certain system have? And what is the impact with increased sea levels to that system? I think also a review of the policies to promote NNBF use, and I'm seeing that happen, but recognizing also that these kind of systems need space and scale to operate best. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the remaining two speakers. I'm really fascinated to hear what they have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and also apologize for my hurry you up. I'm so sorry. We will come back to you for the next round for sure. From what you actually have shared, I think it's a very deep kind of difficulties that all of the nations that has coastal areas actually faces. To my experience, I also share the same feeling as you presented that, climate change actually at first is really difficult to communicate and make people, especially in the local area, who have the coastal affect them the most. And I think the coastal area is not easy. It's from what you're saying is they have diverse community livelihood, they have indigenous people, they have belief, they have way of life that not very easy to change. And when we have to combine it with the solution that might actually have to adapt and transform their nature a bit, that perhaps really not easy way to communicate. And they have, the coastal area has diverse hazard from the climate change and coastal effect. And nonetheless, we are facing to political commitment, how to make policymakers is actually care about this coastal effect, which is really a long term, and it might need a really long term effort as well to actually fix it. Despite the fact that the local mafia and the local political kind of politicians is also play a role in negotiating this kind of benefit as well. So thank you very much for introducing this. Let me move to the next presenter. Let's change the atmosphere a bit. Let's not only that, we're changing to my ladies insurance and economic kind of marketing tools. I also actually think that when we talk about the nature base is might as well also focusing on some of the policy instruments that is not only talking green, gray kind of solutions, physical and governance and management. We also have another sector, which is private company. We have NGOs, we have investor, which is really, they are capable of being a partner of the government as well as helping in terms of mitigating the impact. So let me introduce you to the next speaker of today, Sherry Gray. She is a global lead for sustainability and market development with Swiss Re Public Sector Solutions business. She worked with government, institutions, NGOs, and insurance industry to create opportunities to support the nature-based solution and broader sustainability practices. I think her kind of experience prior to that, she also transforming function across value chain and a lot of strategy in terms of using this. I think her talk will be very interesting because I'm from Southeast Asia. Some of the countries is actually look at insurance kind of like too far-fetched to actually grasp them to be ours kind of thing. It's a little too expensive. Let's see what Sherry have to share with us today. Sherry, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I do hope I can make insurance more accessible to you all by the end of this session. I'll wait for my slides to load up. And when they do, you'll see that I've decided to just put a picture of my office on the front. So this is Swiss Re operate in Sydney, Australia, out of the middle building there. And I just thought this was a really great example of urban science, tech, policy and practice. This is the Barangaroo Precinct in Sydney. It's actually a benchmark carbon neutral initiative. It's got energy efficient buildings, renewable energy, recycled water, there's community green space and Indigenous integration. And it's all along the Sydney Harbour. But what you actually don't see in that photo is the nature-based solution that's actually underneath it, which is an underwater garden. So when they were constructing the site, they also built artificial oyster reefs and rock pools to actually bring back the natural underwater habitat. So what they've done is they've actually brought back the marine life and the much healthier water quality right in the middle of the CBD. So this has actually been refreshing an area that used to be industrial ports. So on the top, it's actually some really nice shiny buildings, but underneath it's a really active nature-based solution. So if we move to the next slide, I'll introduce my company, which is Swiss Re. And Swiss Re is a global reinsurer. And if we move to the next slide, you'll see that our purpose is to actually make the world more resilient. Oh, sorry, we'll just go back to the other one. But as a reinsurer, what we do is we work with insurers, we sit behind the insurers, but we also do work directly with corporate customers and we work with governments, we work with NGOs, institutions and development banks. And we build partnerships as well as provide risk transfer solutions because as you can see in the bubble, you know, most of the risks that we actually have from natural catastrophes to aging actually remain uninsured. So this is what we call the protection gap. And if we move to the next slide, you'll see how that trend is going. So Mark provided some stats in his presentation. I mean, 2.9 trillion in economic losses over the last 20 years. And this is the trend over time. And I mean, unfortunately, what's happening is that climate change is actually no longer a trend or a risk. It's actually becoming a fact. And that actually challenges the notion of what is insurable. And you'll see that on the bottom, the dark green bars, that's actually the insured economic losses. So basically where we've been able to pay out claims. The light green bars are the losses that actually weren't insured. So they were still recorded, but they actually didn't have any kind of insurance. So this is immediately the protection gap. But what you don't see on the slide is actually the losses that aren't recorded. And this particularly are our natural assets. So nature, our natural resources, you know, these eco-services that actually get damaged in natural weather events and by man-made events that actually aren't recorded. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a bit about what Swiss Re has been doing and our journey here. So, I mean, we've been talking about sustainability and impacts to the environment since 1979. That was our first publication where we were talking about the insurance possibilities and impacts on ecology, I think was the term that we used at the time. And what we've been doing since about 2009 is we actually have a formal, what we call our sustainable business risk framework. And what this is actually an integrated policy within our organisation for all of our underwriting and investment decisions, where we actually will do no harm. We will not do business with any companies that harm the environment, that conflict with human rights. And we also have some very strict policies on thermal coal, oil and gas, and forestry and logging. So specific to actually understanding nature and the impacts and the value of it, we started to work with the TEEB, in about 2012. But then what we did last year was we actually created our own Biodiversity and Eco-Services Index. So this is where we actually started to map out the footprint through available information. And we can actually integrate that data set into the flood maps, the storm tracks, the natural perils data that we use already as an insurer. And earlier this year, we joined the Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosures because it was just a very logical progression. And so all of this actually wraps up in our broader sustainability strategy. And this includes our net zero targets. So by 2030, we will actually be net zero in all of our operations. And by 2050, we'll be net zero across our balance sheet. So that means that the companies that we do business with in terms of our underwriting and our asset management will also need to be net zero. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to provide some context as to why protecting nature is actually important for us as an insurer. It is the ultimate resilience and service provider. We all know the amount of economic activity that is dependent on nature, so 55% of global GDP. But when you actually start to break that down into particular ecosystems and services, it becomes quite interesting because 36 billion globally is actually revenue generated by coral reefs. But then coral reefs actually provide 7 times that benefit in terms of resilience and protection. And even if you look at mangroves, I mean, as well as providing, resilience against tidal surge and capturing carbon, they also protect lives, around 15 million that live in vulnerable coastal areas. So nature needs to be protected because it is an exposed asset, but it's also a revenue generating asset. And we also need to enable and redirect the financial flows so that we can actually invest and optimize its effectiveness. So how can insurance help? So if we move to the next slide, we'll have a look at the key players, their roles and motivations. So businesses rely on nature. They rely on the eco services for a lot of their revenue and activity. So by actually, as a business, if you actually look through your value chain, understand your footprint and your dependencies, chances are there's a lot of natural assets that you're actually relying on. With investors, where insurance can help is we can actually de-risk and insure the projects, because we would love to see more green or green-grey projects, as Mark and Richard have described, coming out. But we appreciate that because there are unknowns, because there are new techniques, there's going to be a certain amount of risk. So what insurance can do is actually provide solutions against some of these risks and make the project more bankable, more investable. And lastly, governments, which are probably the biggest audience or target in this sense, because nature tends to be on public land. It tends to cover multiple communities and businesses, and therefore the accountability and ownership is often a complex one. So this is where the responsibility of governments can actually be really supported by insurance, because insurance can actually help to build resilience and take on risk. So if we move to the next slide, I'll explain a bit more about the propositions. So firstly, it's about understanding. It's about awareness and identification. And I mean, as a global reinsurer, we've been around for over 100 years. So you can imagine all the data that we have in terms of flood mapping, in terms of storms, hurricanes, and things like that. But now what we're also able to do is provide some guidance around vulnerable ecosystems. So you'll see the picture there, which is a snapshot of some of the layers in our BES, our Biodiversity and Ecoservices Index. And what that does is then it actually helps to inform planning and decision making. So you can actually assess different sites, you can understand what your exposures are before you actually start building, before you start planning, or to actually understand where you're going to need protection. So the second opportunity is actually to protect and restore natural assets. So this is where insurance can actually be really creative, actually, with what we call index-based solutions. And what this means is that instead of traditional insurance where you actually unfortunately have to have something that's damaged and then the loss adjuster comes out to assess it before the claim is paid, what index insurance solutions do is they're actually triggered by objective data. And the one example here is the case that we did in Mexico a few years ago with a hurricane cover that protected the coral reef there. So the coral reef in Mexico is actually very exposed. It actually gets unfortunately quite annihilated every hurricane season. And what the insurance cover does is it actually is triggered by the wind speed within a certain area. And then that actually releases a payout which provides funds for quick restoration and activity. And then what you'll see there, and sorry, the pictures are a little bit mixed up, but if you look at the crowd of people there, they're actually the Reef Brigades. And these guys are a fantastic team that actually get out in the boats, dive underwater to actually restore the broken fragments, collect them and replant them, help remove all the sediment. And this is what the funds actually pay for. Another opportunity where insurance can help is to enable and de-risk natural infrastructure. And the picture there, which, sorry, is just mixed around, but this is Texel Island in the Netherlands. So maybe Mark has been there and can tell us a bit more about any personal experience there. But what we did was we were actually able to help construct a nature-based solution. So Texel Island, it's a World Heritage Site. You know, there's communities that actually live on there, but the dike, the original dike was at risk of failure. It was a concrete dike. But instead of actually just rebuilding it, what the municipality decided to do was actually adopt a nature-based solution. So they actually moved around 5 million cubic meters of sand. They planted 2 million marram grasses and actually built the gradient. But because this was a really new concept and it was on a World Heritage Site, they actually needed to get the necessary assurances. And for us, that meant that we actually provided them with, I guess, a traditional contract works cover. So they were covered for liability, for damages, delays, and it meant that the project was going to be finished on time and on budget. So it's a really good example of where nature is actually enabled. Sorry, where insurance has enabled a nature-based solution. And lastly, with the emergence of the carbon removal market, there is so much that we can actually do to help scale this up. A lot of the solutions are already sitting in our agriculture portfolios, forestry portfolios, and we see great opportunity to repurpose. So if we move just briefly to the next slide, I just want to talk about, I guess, extreme heat, you know, as an example of where there's an opportunity for the urban and the natural, you know, to really come together. And we've been part of the Extreme Heat Coalition that was established a couple of years ago, so the Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance. And this is actually a group of cities, states, as well as public sector, private sector, climate science, disaster management groups, all coming together. And, you know, some of the opportunities and solutions that we're working on. So firstly, it's about building resilience and productivity, because you can use some of these index-based insurance products because you can use a trigger of temperature, heat waves, humidity, And then in turn, that will release funds to actually support emergency actions. It can support the relocation of the elderly and vulnerable. And there's also insurance programs that actually protect against the financial impacts of a business interruption. And then you have climate adaptation. So this is where there's fantastic opportunity to increase green space and canopies, integrating the carbon capture, but also natural flood protection into the urban environment. And then lastly, investing in resilient infrastructure. So insurance can actually enable more innovative and green projects like Texel Island, which creates more agility and protection against damages from events, but also the subsequent shutdowns and economic flow-on impacts. So my last slide, I guess just to close and to wrap up, just to call out the role of insurance. So reinsurance in particular is one of the truly global industries. So we can compare and benchmark very quickly. So we can use these insights and data to really help plan and support. Because as an insurer, we are in the business of paying claims, but we actually prefer that you didn't build on the flood zone in the first place. So if we can actually help you identify that, that's actually a win for everyone. We can use insurance to de-risk investment, and we can also use insurance to actually restore nature and actually use it as a mitigation and resilience building tool. So with that, I close. Look forward to the last presentation and discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherry. It's really interesting to me because the insurance is actually, usually when people look at insurance, they always look at it as afterward, kind of like after the fact. You invest before, that's true, but then the insurance most of the time is taken as a recovering and as taken as leverage and mitigate to the financial effect only. But then your point it actually brought up in terms of trying to also use insurance as a preemptive, the prompt in terms of squeezing in, I don't know what word's supposed to be, integrating it into the mitigation, prevention, and have people care more. But then I also realized from your last two slides, I guess, I was reading between the line that to make insurance is actually working, we kind of like need risk criteria. We kind of need risk analysis and assessment and make sure that the criteria and the information of risk is actually official enough or solid enough to make an insurance is actually work accordingly, because at the bottom line, insurance industry and else, they actually have to look at their kind of gain as well, the balance between their responsibility to the society else. So thank you very much. We will come back. And my last speaker of today, and last, I saved the last for like the best for last here. And Tite is actually, I already named him a wizard of Asia. And that is the reason why I actually did that. Actually, I give names without permission. I'm sorry. Tite is actually a regional manager of Deltares for Asia. He is actually responsible for coordination and development of research and specialist consultancy studies in Asian region. And this is not just kind of like overclaiming. He has a lot of project and work experience done in, let me say, Thailand, of course, my country, Philippines, Myanmar, Indonesia, Vietnam, India, and China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore. Oh my God, I can actually name all of them. So he is really a wizard to me, because most of the time you have people who work in the field and they know a lot about different lands, different capacities, different governing system. And he is also have his kind of expertise on risk management and mathematical modeling in monitoring studies in terms of water resource management. So I think we will kind of like having him as the last but not the least, kind of speaking on this nature-based solution. So Tite, your floor is right now.
Thank you for the nice introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here today and to present some of our work, our recent work on a resilient city toolbox. Can I have the first slide, please? Yeah, next, please. What I would like to demonstrate here is that there is a tool where we can just investigate what nature-based solutions, or what I call here blue-green solutions, can mean and can make a difference for an urban area. You see here the city of Shanghai, Pudong, and the flooding in it, and it's a completely paved, built-up area. Difficult to find solutions in cities that grow that fast and where there is limited drainage capacity. What I will do in this presentation, I'll give you an example in a moment of the city of Yangon in Myanmar. The project was finished earlier this year, just before the coup. And that gives you an idea what nature-based solutions can do for a city like that. Next one, please. First, a few words about our Knowledge Institute. We are the National Research Institute in the Netherlands for water and subsurface issues. A knowledge partner of the Dutch government, but also other governments, trusted advisor therefore. We are independent, we are not for profit, and we are known, I think, all along the globe for our model systems and physical research facilities. And you see some of them here on the pictures to the right. Below the largest flume in the world, the delta flume, where we just in this case test the wave dampening effect of willow trees just when they were planted before a dike. And the project itself appeared to be very productive because the dike did not have to be designed that high, and therefore there was a lot of cost savings on this one. Well, an institute, 2 locations in the Netherlands, a couple of offices elsewhere in the world, 800 staff, 42 different nationalities. Next slide, please. When I talk about resilience in relation to urban environments, there is a sense of urgency. We notice that there are a lot of developments in those areas. Cities are growing very fast. There's lack of space, lack of drainage capacity, and therefore all sorts of problems pop up. And the example I will demonstrate here in a bit is all about flood resilience, but there are also other issues like pollution, droughts, water quality, heat stress. And the tool I'm presenting here can handle all of them. Of course, these cities are also exposed to accelerated sea level rise, storm surges, affecting all sorts of communities. And the city of Yangon has all of it. It has a fluvial component, a riverine component, an urban component, and a coastal component. What we should realize is there is a kind of paradigm shift lately from civil engineering works to more nature-based solutions in order to establish more sustainable and resilient environments and also to do something about cost effectiveness. However, towards the uncertain future, we also deal with the uncertainty of these nature-based solutions. They're not all working as predictable as what we thought. Still, cities need to adapt for this uncertain future. Above all, and that's what I would like to emphasize in this presentation, we need to understand our system. We need to understand the urban environment. Next slide, please. And the sponges I showed on the previous slide can be worked out in a kind of, well, call it a water balance. Something comes in, something goes out, and something happens in between. So in this case, rain comes in, canals come in, or rivers come in. They infiltrate into the soil, they run off, they evaporate. And by knowing this and by knowing the soil types and the land use, we understand how water behaves in a certain urban environment. Next one. But it's always the crucial first step. Like I said, I will give you an example of this area. This is the greener part of the city of Yangon. There is also the central business district, very built-up area, paved areas with little infiltration possibilities. This was a project we did for the World Bank. ADPC was our partner in this, and there were 2 others, a local company and a financing company. Next one, please. This is this project where we had to come up with an investment program fully financed by the World Bank It should result in an integrated flood resilience strategy and to not only resist floods by making high dikes, but also to relieve and recover from impacts when it happens. On the animation to the left, you see the reconstruction of the cyclone Nargis in 2008. And by looking into the extremes, you have to come up with solutions to deal with that. Next one, please. The city of blue, green, and gold. It was the starting one. This is how we started with a very detailed flood model for the urban area. You see on the lower part, the central business district. We had to deal with the fluvial component from the Irrawaddy River, fluvial component, heavy rainfall on the city area, and a coastal component with storm surges coming from the south. Next one, please. And this is where the Resilient City Toolbox comes in. It is a toolbox which we developed as a collaborative planning tool to deal with a better understanding of the system and to come up with interventions as a kind of co-design example. And with all the stakeholders together, we can redesign a city. It is a kind of GIS environment where you can just make polygons on top of it, and you immediately see the impact of what you do in terms of interventions you propose, in terms of change in storage capacity, in groundwater recharge, evaporation, heat reduction, cooling areas, but also quality, etc. The toolbox itself nowadays has some 50 to 70 different nature-based solutions in its database, so you can play around with a lot of different interventions. Next one, please. It is freeware software. You can just download it from crctool.org and you can play around with it yourself. It is including a lot of these sorts of solutions, both soft, but also sometimes some of them hard engineering solutions that come with all sorts of benefits. It not only deals in this case with floods in the city, but it can also improve the air quality, the water quality, the living quality, and the human health. And the moment you propose these sorts of interventions and you start working on it, we always say make work with work and try to do more and try to combine it with recreational areas or parks, or even combine it with livelihood opportunities, give jobs to local people. Next one, please. We have to realize that although we strongly prefer nowadays these blue-green nature-based solutions, they often require more space, and space is something which is simply not there in all these fast-growing cities, especially these megacities. Gray solutions often require much less space. On the other hand, they are more costly, they need maintenance, where nature-based solutions are more flexible and more cost-effective. Next one, please. So what is this toolbox? It's a tool to support the dialogue in the Netherlands, but I think that applies now to many countries in the world. You cannot do something in your urban environment anymore without consulting all your stakeholders. So we have to do it together. And the RCT provides estimates on the effects of all sorts of interventions against extreme rainfall, drought, heat stress, water quality, etc. And the result of that can then be used for further design by landscape architects or urban planners, you name it. What we have to realize is that many of the design standards come from early days and we have to update them. And sometimes, for high return periods here, as you can see to the right, they are not sufficient. Next one, please. So we can use a tool like this on a touch table or on a big screen with all the stakeholders around and play around with different designs and different interventions and come up with estimates on the hydrological effectiveness, the cost, and alternatives. As you can just play around with all the 70 measures available. Next one, please. So back to Yangon, if we zoom in on a certain part where we tested 4 different pilot areas in the urban environment, on the left pane you see the flood simulation, in this case with a return period of 10 years, no surge, spring tide and low river discharge. And on the right, you see how we played around with the available space in this specific area and coming up with different measures here, adding trees to this, the landscape, the bioswales, urban forest, rain barrels, retention areas, you name it. In general, what we try to do is, and this is also a hilly area flowing down to the surrounding rivers, we try to retain upstream, store where possible, and if not possible anymore, we drain. Next one, please. So this is basically what this pilot area ended up with, different interventions, the bioswales, the infiltration fields, rain barrels, rainwater retention pond, and lowering of terraces. And on the right, you see the impacts of this combination of measures, the cost involved here, expressed still as euros, but we can do it in any local cost, of course, and additional impacts. This is nowadays a tool that comes with different interfaces. We recently made the Chinese interface for the city of Changtan, so it's a completely Chinese environment then. Next one, please. But we have to realize, in this case for Yangon, that the structural measures combined and that basically the nature-based solutions can only address 10 to 20% of the problem-solving capacity. So that means that only 10 to 20% of the floods can be addressed by these sorts of solutions, local solutions. So we need to do more. We need to do more to protect the city against floods at the city scale. And in addition, we also need to consider all sorts of non-structural measures, and all of them together in the package of what we call the plan for the city, bring it from the initial risk to the residual risk, and in this case to be established by the year 2040. Next one, please. Together, that looks then in a plan form like this: coastal protections, barriers, such non-structural things, but also a lot of storage, infiltration, diversion, nature-based solutions where possible. So a combination of all these sorts of structural and non-structural solutions. Next one, please. Basically, and that's my last slide. This is then the message coming from here. Data and urban system understanding is key. If you don't understand your system, you don't understand where the water comes from and how to handle it, your solutions most likely will either over-design or under-design. In the last case, not perform. We say blue-green where possible and integrated in the landscape with all the stakeholders, but still gray where needed. Sometimes you simply do not have the space to consider blue-green solutions. Or blue-green solutions cannot do what you ultimately need to do to meet the design standards. Consider the uncertainties towards the future, but also uncertainties in relation to the nature-based solutions. Many of these dynamic systems are hard to predict, and they are evolving over time, so they need to be monitored carefully. Well, in general, plan for the future. You know, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail, but be adaptive. And the conditions are changing constantly, so we have to be ready for that. So be flexible in your approach. That means sometimes we reserve space for future measures or go different ways when we do so. Next one, please. It's my final. I thank you for your attention. And this is once again a zoomed in picture on the experiments with the willow trees. Next year, we try to do exactly the same with mangroves and see what the wave dissipation effect of mangroves on the foreshore could be. Mangroves we also considered in this case for the Yangon case. So to create a mangrove belt to protect the city against waves. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, TK. Actually, your last slide bring up 3 colors that you actually want the message to take home: blue, green, and gray. And I really like the quote at the end that blue and green where possible and gray where needed. I actually really love it. At first, when I see the topic of the toolbox, and I actually create the question before listening to you, that how can we actually integrate and make the structural and non-structural, and also kind of like all the design of the city where the diversity is really a lot in together. And then when I listen to your presentation and your speaker, I actually like the idea to bring up that when we do this, the toolboxes kind of bring up the idea of you actually resist and you recover and you rebuild to just, if I can add another R, it would be ready to actually see the next risk to come. With that comprehensive design, it's really need multi-dimensional kind of data analysis. And when you finish it, that toolbox also allow the platform, the dialogue between stakeholders to somehow tell their needs of how they live their life in together with this. It's really a good combination for me. So thank you very much for your presentation. Okay, we are getting into the last kind of period. Actually, I've been told by the organizer to end by 3:30, but then I'm using the power of moderator. I'm going to extend it to about 15 minutes. So our last session can... Hi, can you... Hi, hello. Did you hear me for all that I talk, or I just talk to myself? Actually, Tita, can you hear me now?
I do.
Right. Okay, I'm sorry. My microphone is actually mute briefly. Can I bring back my speakers? Okay, this is what we're gonna do. Since we have question and answer, we have some of the people in the chat, which I'm not sure they're gonna raise hand or not. But then we have question a lot in our Q&A. Let's do this as time provides. I'm going to have each of you pick the question from the question and answer box that you perhaps have not had a chance to answer yet, and answer in person, so that people who ask can actually feel like they talk to us. And if any audience have another kind of question, and if you happen to be able to somehow raise your hand or post a question, you can do so. We will do it as round go by. Please limit your answer to 1 minute per question, so that perhaps we can do 2 rounds. Since Mark, you have the resting time the most, I'm gonna go to you first. Mark, can you pick one question and respond?
Well, there was one question. Urbanization as solution of nature-based risk reduction needs better urban planning. However, how would we start in transforming such a long historical mega city with poor urban planning? How do we create this change? And this is a super good question that we always face, and it's a key question. So change is always very difficult, and empirical data and evidence is not always sufficient to create change in habits in urban planning, and also in the dominant thinking and in political discourse. So what we need to change the thinking in urban planning is to create some sort of a momentum. We can try to do that by continuously advocating for the added value of green, nature-based solutions in well-being, in economic value, in lowering health risks. We can continuously advocate those topics for nature-based solution. We might create momentum with that. What always works is to use the momentum. This is not an ideal case, but if there is an impact, there is a flood with a significant impact, this momentum can be used to say, this may never happen again. Like in the Netherlands, we have now a pretty strong infrastructure saving us from storm surge, and high level of water. But this whole infrastructure, nature-based and grey infrastructure alike, have only been implemented after a disaster in 1953. So we needed a disaster to create the momentum on the political agenda to create change. And unfortunately, it often comes down to the felt need to really make a change in urban planning. my main advice for this. Use the momentum that you can create, and maybe use an example of a city close to the city you are working for or advising on, a city that is close where something happens, and to put forward the exposure of the city that you are working in or advising on. Like we need to protect, because what happened there can happen here. And then obviously it's also about giving some perspective of covering the costs, because the costs will be now and the benefits will be in the future. But in the end, it boils down to political leadership and creating political leadership, to carrying and to advocate for these changes to actually happen.
Okay, thank you very much. And I kind of like shared that experience a bit too, to the city that perhaps is too crowded, like compact and mega city. When we try to make change to the structure, infrastructure or else, sometimes we need to relocate people a bit, and that even make it difficult if we don't have a good explanation using a leadership and bring up the momentum of a longer safety rather than a sudden kind of like change that disturbs them. Thank you. Let's move to you, Richard. Is there any question in the Q&A that you would like to respond?
So Anna's question on that she's convinced that NBS is the way to go, but the process seems to be intimidating, especially for local NGOs. I think it is, but I think it is becoming less so. There, even politically and socially, I think there is a change and a groundswell for people wanting to see something different and improving the natural environment. But I guess a really good way of doing something to make a start is through a pilot. So rather than a big ambitious scheme, let's pick a pilot, let's do it well, let's have a look, demonstrate it, show it to people so they can see how it actually works. So it's really not, it's theory's great, but if they can see it in the ground and understand and see it working, that's going to give you the best way forward.
Yes, I do agree as well. And somehow during that process is really painful at some point. And that's even stir up the feeling of we kind of like looking at it closer to our today more than in the process of long run. So it's really difficult, even though we know that it's the best way to go. Particularly if you have we are now in a kind of atmosphere momentum of trying to have a new Bangkok governor, and we kind of within that process of bringing how to make a flood and water management in this kind of the city work, and it doesn't seem to actually have light yet.
Well, another thing is a pitch to Cherie and see is there a good insurance angle to help make it more affordable and more reliable.
Yep, and thank you for linking to Sherry for me. That is good. I have a moderator helper here. Sherry, then pick that up and then move to your question and answer.
Yeah, so well, I'll take the question about insurance being a luxury, but also try and answer some of the questions that talk about climate adaptation and getting started. Because, I mean, as I mentioned at the start, you know, what we want to do is we actually want to close this protection gap. So a big part of our sustainability strategy is actually creating more access and affordability for insurance. And so that is about raising awareness. It is about making creative and innovative products, such as these index products. And it's also about using digitization and broader distribution, particularly for life and health. You know, we've actually kind of set ourselves targets of number of lives covered to actually really track the impact that we can make. But climate change is, you know, one of the biggest challenges. And if you recall that trend, the protection gap, 90% of that is actually in Asia. So we do actually have a large presence here where we work with both private sector and public sector partners. And it is about changing that mindset. So firstly, as an individual, yes, it's a luxury to insure your car if you have one, but also, you know, really think about your income and your family. I know it's a bit off topic from nature, but this is where we actually really see a lot of the need, unfortunately, and the gaps. But where we actually see a critical, I guess, critical audience here is the public sector, because this is where the government can actually provide that coverage for their community. So they can provide it as a health program, but they can also provide it as a disaster resilience and climate adaptation activity. So if the government is the insurance buyer, the government can actually take out an insurance policy that will release funds after a catastrophic event. So this means that there's actually cash available to rescue, to relocate people, to subsidize incomes, to, you know, set up hospitals, to actually do recovery actions. And all of this can actually happen quickly rather than actually waiting for, you know, budget reallocations or extra funding or raising taxes. So this is a message that we do really want to get out, because this is how we also see insurance being more effective and, you know, being actually more accessible. And I'll just kind of, you know, add on just to Anna's point around getting started. Again, if you're thinking about, you know, insurance as an enabler, right, as something that actually gets you to be prepared, then it's a way that you can actually kick off your projects. So to get started, you know, I recommend just get started. Just, you know, don't overanalyze the research and the data, because it's going to change once you actually put it into practice. So the best way to actually get the data is to actually do it live. And as an insurer, that's what we want. We actually want to know how it's going to work in reality, not in theory. And so if your project has all these different components, insurance can usually cover a lot of it, which means that your exposure and the amount of equity that you've got to wear is going to be less. So it actually makes it a lot easier to get started. But happy to talk more offline about that as needed.
Thank you very much. I share that feeling as well, because I'm a policy analyst, and most of the time the other thing that helps is bad news. When bad news come, it's actually change how people actually react and how people make decisions on this. Flood in Bangkok in kind of like 2011. Afterward, the insurance protection, flood, those kind of, it's also cheaper. And people seem to be able to kind of like want to have that as a very least of the protection. But then this COVID kind of like stirred that up a bit, and then the insurance companies seem to back off. But the COVID is actually too much for them to bear, I guess. So yes, we really need a role of government to perhaps subsidize some of little portion from insurance fund or catastrophe bond or those kind of things that we can actually create. Okay, Tite, you would actually be grab up, and before I turn to you, the three of you have to prepare for a second round of either pick the other question or having your conclusion in 1 minute. I'm gonna go second round on you guys, and then we will be done of today. Tite, can you please grab your question of your choice?
I see a very interesting one, which is the relation between absorption, ponds, wetlands in urban areas and aquifer generation. And I think the last is especially necessary to address soil subsidence, which is an ongoing process in many of these big cities in Asia. Take Bangkok, take Jakarta, take Manila, take Ho Chi Minh. All these cities go down rapidly due to groundwater abstractions. Well, ponds can, of course, do something, but for ponds you need space. And in these urban environments, that's sometimes a big issue. Here in the Netherlands, and it was at the time I was a board member of the Regional Water Authority, we have considered water squares in urban areas. In my city here, the city of Rotterdam, a very dense part of the city where we converted a certain part of the city into a recreational playground. And the moment the rain came in, it could be used for temporary retention area, storage area. And then later on, we could slowly pump it out. That was not with the idea to bring it to the groundwater. But I can imagine that if you have these sorts of opportunities, you could consider this. Artificial recharge of those areas in cities that go down rapidly I think is a way to go, and we need to consider that. But like I said, space is often the limiting factor here.
I do agree with you.
And that's exactly the discussion we have at the moment, by the way, with BMA, because
yeah.
we are developing at the moment a very detailed flood forecasting and early warning system for all of Bangkok. But Bangkok also has very limited space, and still the city is going down 2 centimeters per year or so. So you would like to do something against that. And well, we're in discussion at the moment on what to do and where to do it in the city to revert such a process.
I also think that it's also difficult because Bangkok has less space, and some of the space is identified as some owner is actually private owned, and is really kind of like cannot have a lot of jurisdiction over Bangkok. Is really like difficult. There's the other difficulties present to them too.
Correct.
Right. Thank you for the first round. Let's go to last round. I would actually have either, as I said, you can actually pick up any question of your interest that has left, or you can combine, integrate that question into your conclusion or another kind of message or punchline that you want to leave this webinar with. Let's go ahead. Mark, you would actually go first at the same time. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's inspiring listening to those questions and those answers. And what Richard mentioned, I want to amplify. What I presented just now in reshaping the thinking of urban planning, I almost called for like a revolution in the thinking, and you need big impact to make big change. That's true. But what is also true is that pilots and small scale projects are super important. So it's not always about creating a revolution in the thinking. It can be a slow steps of an evolution. What we did on an island in the Caribbean, that's not disaster related, but we created a sewage treatment plant based on nature-based initiatives. So let nature clean sewage. And normally sewage is something that you want to stay away from. But if in this natural treatment of sewage, we created a park which was visited by a lot of people and actually valued for its nature value. So we created a green zone using nature-based solution for sewage treatment, and this impacts the thinking and the public opinion on the value of green. This could be a very simple part of creating a small evolution as a first step in thinking more about green solutions, also for climate change adaptation. So evolution instead of a revolution.
Wow, that's a good punchline. I like it. Okay, Richard.
Yeah. Well, I think Mark has said it really. I guess making that information available, building those case studies that can be shared by other communities and other areas. So what is transferable skills and knowledge? Where can it apply for? From an engineering perspective, what I like to see is, I guess, details on how it performs. And Titu was showing the wave flume and understanding how mangroves dissipate energy. As an engineer, I can convince clients, if there's data and evidence from testing and from research and science, to give it a go. And all of those help build knowledge and help build examples that can be applied elsewhere if it's published on platforms that other people can access. So I think do those pilots, share the information, the results, both the wins and the failures, because there will be both. But that will help grow that community knowledge and understanding. That's me.
Wow, if you have a little bit more time, I will get to that pilot and sandbox. That would be really nice. Let's do it next year. Shari, your turn.
Yes, I will take Bikram's question to go into my closing, which is how hard or easy is it to implement index insurance? And I guess really, look, it does depend on where you are. There are some regulatory challenges in some countries, but that's usually because it's actually not well understood. It's actually still a relatively new concept. So do talk to us, because we have overcome this with combination products, but also really ensuring that the design is robust, because it's doing something that's new and different and unknown, like nature-based solutions, right? So my final words are, please just get started and use insurance as a mitigation and resilience building tool, not just for compensation. Thank you all.
Thank you, Sherry. I already love your closing, and I will definitely send my student to you soon. I also said I saved the best for last. Tite, can you please somehow close this session for me? Your turn.
Oh boy. Well, the only thing I would like to make mention of is that in the Netherlands in 2008, we formed a consortium of contractors, engineering firms, research institutes, NGOs, and governmental organizations to address nature-based solutions, building with nature. And over time, that has delivered a wealth of nice projects, which everybody can check through the EcoShape website. They also summarized it in a very nice booklet, which we call Building with Nature. And that includes applications on coastal cases, on inland cases, on urban cases, all over the globe. Many of them, of course, in the Netherlands, but it gave us, with all these pilots together, a lot of evidence that things like that could work. It builds on each other. And in the Netherlands, well, the idea was to share know-how among all these organizations, and that now expands rapidly, because there are, like I showed in the wave flume, but there are many of those experiences elsewhere in the world, in Indonesia, in the Philippines at the moment, you name it. So I would encourage everybody to check on the EcoShape website and check on pilots, guideline reports, whatever.
Thank you very much. I will be the first one who joined it and apply for consortium if you actually want someone from the other part of Bangkok. I will definitely join that. And thank you very much for the four of you. It's really fun time for me. And for your information, I have a lot of my acquaintance and students inbox me that this one is really a precise session, and we stick to the point and we hit the head real hard, and they find it really fun, which is not very typical for my students to say that it's a fun session for them. So thank you very much for all of you that bring up this kind of hybrid topic, this kind of knowledge to this webinar today. And I think it's really useful, and the information we got today and the collaboration and also the knowledge sharing that we're going to have in the future would actually make the webinar in the future of RateCon and all of us association and partners is actually going to help a bit of resilience is evolution or revolution. So the next year we will get that, right, Mark? Okay, before we end this, Monica, you still here? Let me bring back the organizer, as well as I think there is some survey waiting for the participants. If you care enough, please fill up the survey as well for us, and so that we can have the information that perhaps help us as well to hold the next one really more fun and fabulous. So Monica, I give the webinar back to you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Tavida, Cherry, Richard, Tite, Mark. Yeah, and to all of you who join us today in this very exciting exchange. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. So just before you sign off, we would be eternally grateful if you can just like send your answer for the survey questions that you are seeing right now, so we can shape the next webinar according to your preferred topic or your preferred theme. And we look forward to having you with us again on our next webinar series next year. Yeah, so we hope that everyone will have a very festive holiday season, yeah, with your families and friends. And we look forward to seeing you at Redcon Asia 2022 next year. So thank you so much and have a great rest of this week. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you, Monica. Also, I didn't see the last message. Sorry. Thank you. See you soon.
We didn't have a picture though, but no
Oh,
worries.
that's right.
I did have a lot of
Capture, snapshot.
no worries, no worries. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. Kapamana ka, Dr. Tawida.
See you.
Ka.
สวัสดีค่ะ